everyone, and welcome to our third session here in the Gurdjieff Unveiled study group. And we welcome everybody under the auspices of the Theosophical Society of America, we're sponsored by the TS, but our hostess is Mary Magnani. Our facilitators for this great book written by Sy Ginsburg is Sy Ginsburg himself, Harry Gray, and me, Gwen Mayer. And so we will get started. First, let me say that each of the chapters in Gurdjieff Unveiled they're listed as lessons. We are still on lesson 2. I am going to basically change our wording to this is session 3. And when I ask you to read, like, the next 2 sessions that we have will probably be on chapter 3 in Gurdjieff Unveiled. So I don't want to get confused with the terminology. Hence, I've also put who is in charge of each section on and what the page numbers are, so you know that we're coming out of the book.
Everybody should know that there's another diagram. I do think you have a slide of it. I don't know if it's in this presentation. It comes out of Ouspensky. And while I actually like what's on the screen better than what's in Ouspensky, Ouspensky's explanation has served the test of time. I was thinking about this during the week, and it's more than 70 years. And so most people who have gotten beyond reading about the principles of the Gurdjieff work, and that's what we're doing, these are principles, into the actual work itself, begin to work with the attention. It's our only tool that we have. And when we observe it carefully, we discover that our attention is always taken. That is, we are not the masters of our attention. If you're listening to me, maybe seeing me on the screen, I'm taking your attention. Sy is taking your attention, in a certain sense, taking your energy, because energy will follow the attention. So in our ordinary state of our attention being taken by what comes in through the senses or what has previously come in through the senses and stored in memory, this is what we're slaves to. And these things are all aspects of the personality. What we're trying to do, and this is called the work, capital W in Gurdjieff's lingo, is to practice this primary principle, which is to gain control over our attention. And the way Gurdjieff suggested to do it is, there are many ways to do it, but he favored including part of our physical presence in our attention. Now that's in addition to whatever else is coming in to our attention. Right now, if you're trying to have your attention include the sensation of your left hand, maybe it's including the experience of Sy taking your attention. Now this is where that slide with the 2 arrows, anybody that has the books, it's a very simple, it's the simplest diagram. It's on page 19 of Gurdjieff Unveiled and on page 119 of In Search of the Miraculous. Now, Ouspensky's idea is that in our ordinary experience, we just have our attention being taken. So in that arrow you see on the screen right now, there's not 2 arrowheads. There's only 1 arrowhead. That's the other drawing. And that means that our attention is being taken by what's coming in through the senses. Ouspensky says, quoting Gurdjieff, that the work is to divide the attention. And so when we do that, we have a line with 2 arrowheads, like it's shown on the screen. The problem, and why this is not entirely correct, at least in my view, is that it seems to be the idea that attention is a fixed amount. There it is, right there. Okay? This is quoted from In Search of the Miraculous. This is Ouspensky now talking about his experience. When I observe something, my attention is directed toward what I observe, a line with one arrowhead. So there's I over in the left, and at the other end of the line is the one arrowhead, which, let's say in this case, is Sy, the image of Sy, the voice of Sy, and that's where your attention is. Now, when I try to remember myself, and this is the key, if we learn nothing else, if we try to do this is the key to the teaching, not just in Gurdjieff's teaching, but in other practical teachings. We divide the attention so that not only is Sy in your attention, but okay, here's another drawing of it. Not only is Sy in your attention, but the sensation of whatever it is you put your attention on in the physical body, if that's what you've used. Your hands, your breath, your butt, these are all things. However, the problem is it gives the misidea that attention is a fixed amount. In other words, let's say we have 100 gallons of attention, and if we don't divide it, all of that 100 gallons is taken by what's coming in through the senses. When we divide it, then we could say, okay, 50% is coming in through the senses, and 50% is the sensation of my left hand, if that's what we're doing. But that's not entirely correct, because attention is a dynamic quality. In other words, it can expand. So in my view, anyhow, it's more correct to say that when I try to self-remember, like Ouspensky was saying in that previous slide, when I try to self-remember, there it is right there, my attention is directed toward both the object observed and toward myself. A second arrowhead appears on the line. However, that does not mean that 50 gallons is in the observed phenomenon and 50 gallons is on my left hand. I can expand the attention so that maybe through effort, and this has to do with energies, I've got now maybe 125 gallons of attention. I hope I'm making this clear, because this is the key practical work. And this work, and is done in many different ways, always has to do with the attention. So if you get nothing else out of this, try to remember, and this is a huge effort, because we've been miseducated and mistrained since the beginning of our experience in this life, to think that we are the personality, the body, the physical body, the brain, and the emotions. That's not who we are, but it takes such a long time to undo this, and the way to undo it is with this divided or expanded attention. That's the beginning of getting out of the miseducation that we are the personality. We're something much greater than the personality. All of these teachings, not just Gurdjieff's, all esoteric teachings, point to this great thing, that we are something else. If you want to call it soul, fine. If you like to call it God, fine. Gurdjieff called it endlessness. That's the word he liked. So this is the work. This is, if there's nothing else, the work is right on the page that you're looking at, right out of the Ouspensky book. And if there are better drawings, like Gwen's drawing, that gives it more accurately. And so I wanted to make that point, and I'd like to just open this up to anybody who has any questions about it. It's, in my view anyhow, it's exceedingly important. So I'll say over for a moment.
And I also want to say that we bring it up in every chapter but like you said, this is the basis of the work. So if you're not noticing what your attention is, like the yogis have a way of, the yoga practices have a way of calming themselves to pay attention just to the body or to the breathing, to their motion, but they're in silence. There is, Blavatsky wrote a book on Voice of Silence. It allows you to go into your inner self, pay attention to your inner world. So there's all kinds of traditions that are going to bring in this.
If
So
you want me to talk about men number 1 through 7, I can do that. This is a perfect segue into it, if that's what you'd like to
okay,
do.
so the way I took it was as you had presented it in the chapter. So if you're going to start with, because in the chapter you start with man number 7, and
Right.
then you were going to talk about that. So go ahead and.
Okay.
Well, first, does anybody have any questions about attention? I think you were in a period of non-identification when you were placing your attention on something or somebody else, and you said you were separate from your body or not with your body. That's, I believe, an example of a non-identification, which is good. Well, wouldn't you say, Sy?
Yes, I would.
Or with anything.
No,
Yeah.
with the personality, which includes the body, the physical body, the emotions, and the thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay, Gwen asked me to talk about. It's difficult to talk about man number 7 and man number 6 because these are higher states of man, and unless you exist in one of these states, you're only talking intellectually about it, and that's really what these paragraphs do. And I think Gwen is correct that it might be better to have looked at it from the other way first, starting with man number 1, number 2, and number 3.
Why don't you go ahead and explain it? Because I think that you're right. So I've got man number 1, 2, and 3 on here, and you can go forward.
So man number 1, man number 2, and man number 3 are all equal in terms of what Gurdjieff would call their level of being. In other words, they're all equally unconscious or relatively unconscious compared to what a man number 6 or 7 could be. They're equal, but they're different. And the reason they're different is because, and this seems to be a characteristic of human life, is that when we come into this human life, most of us tend to favor one of these man number 1, number 2, or number 3. In other words, some people favor their physicality, and they may be natural athletes. They may be attracted to hatha yoga, which is a physical practice, or they may be attracted to the intellectual discussion of ideas like what we're talking about now. Talking about it is not the same as practicing it. So a man number 3 is equal to man number 1, except that she is oriented around the importance of the intellect. Number 1 around the importance of physicality, and number 2 around the importance of emotion or the emotional center. Now, it's a problem. The reason this is a problem is because when we're identified, it gets back to this identification of the personality with one characteristic or another, when we're identified, then we're not free. We're the captive of what we identify with. So Gurdjieff says what you need to do is to balance yourself. In other words, if you're a man number 1, you've got to try and become a number 2 and a number 3. You've got to work on your emotions and on your intellect. If you're a man number 3, you've got to work on developing man number 1 and man number 2 in you. In other words, let's say you're this terrific intellectual person, but you hate exercises, you hate doing yoga postures, you hate all of that stuff. Well, too bad. You've got to work on it. And this is exactly what Gurdjieff did with his pupils at the Priory, his residential school. Maurice Nicole is an example of it. He writes about it. Nicole had a great intellect. He was a professional psychiatrist and also very connected with the emotions. But he didn't like one bit doing physical stuff, so what did Gurdjieff do? He made him get out in the field and dig a well, physical work, so that he could get in touch with the sweat on his hands and the soreness of his muscles. And so by practicing all of these things, you become free of the one, or freer of the one with which you're naturally identified. And when
Can I say something real quick about that?
Sure, go
Because
ahead.
on a simpler level, you're always operating from three centers: your moving center, your emotional, your intellect. So when he was talking about Maurice Nicole was a medical doctor and he was also a psychiatrist. He stayed in his head most of the time. That is not called a balance centering. So Gurdjieff had an instinct about that. When he saw people caught in their heads, they did a lot of physical exercises. If women, for instance, he was around, were caught in their emotion and their feeling, and I'm just using women because, women are good about that, then he would assign more something to balance out, and it was always an exercise. That's why in the Gurdjieff work, the work groups are always about exercises. Very little intellectual. We're doing a lot of studying of the ideas, but a work group is all about exercising to balance those centers. So over to you, Sy.
Okay, and of course the purpose of this Gurdjieff Unveiled is to present the principles. So if you want to continue in a work group, you know what it's about. It's not a strange language to you. In other words, there's a commonality of language when we're talking about men number 1 through 7. So simply to continue with that, Gurdjieff said that if you can balance yourself, your man number 1, number 2, and number 3, so that you're freer of any of these one positions, then you become a man number 4. And he said man number 4 is the product of work on yourself. No one is born as a man number 4. So I'm going to turn it over to Harry. Over to you, Harry.
Man number 4 is already working with his 3 centers: physical, mental, and emotional. And he has begun perhaps a search for the meaning of life. Why are we here? And he may be in the process of developing a magnetic center. Now, when someone is on the path to man number 4, it's a process. We call it an octave, more so than the first 3 centers. This is a little bit different. He's on a path to become man number 4, but he's in that octave. He's in that process. We'll talk about octaves later. But he's developing a center of gravity. He knows what he wants. He has an aim, and he's not satisfied with, life as he knows it, with, appears to be meaningless, no aim, no answer to questions. Why are we here? Why is there life? So he's working toward number 5 with continued efforts. And he's working on himself, and he may have found a way. He may have found, for example, a Gurdjieff group, or being introduced to his teachings. And he's done this through efforts on his own thus far, but now he begins. And as he goes on, and it can take years before he actually becomes man number 4. And begins the process of becoming man number 5. But there's always the danger of falling back, of something happening, of life getting in the way, so you leave the group and you're without resources for a while. You can always fall back and lose what you've gained, even if you become higher man number 5 and 6 and so forth. But man number 4 is centered. He's balanced. He has an aim, and he is continuing to work on himself towards man number 5. Man number 4 again, is a solidified man with the human being of man number 1, 2, and 3. He's approached the end and approached another octave to become man number 5. And man number 5, he's in a continual state of self-observation. And he sees glimpses of what we call a real world. Now, by that, I mean, you may have a moment when you see things as they really are. It's like an epiphany. It's like a revelation. It's equivalent of being in a cathedral, and you're in a vestibule, and you open the door a crack into the nave, the hall, and so forth. And that's the real world. But you open that door a crack, and it's just a glimpse. But what you see is a tremendous amount of the real world. And at that moment, you really become awed with life and what's possible. And you're in contact with the higher emotional center at times. And that is very, very special. It is possible to contact the higher intellectual center if you do that through the higher emotional. But again, that's down the road and for further sessions. And again, even in man number 5, something can happen and you can lose it. You can fall back. And once you obtain, if anyone attains man number 7, then you cannot fall back. So there's always a danger of falling back, of losing what you've gained. So there's always a continual effort to work on yourself.
Can you or Sy give some examples of people that they may know that are functioning at number 4 and functioning at number 5? And as you said, these are interchangeable. They go back and forth. We have, so this continuum is a continuum. And it all aims toward unitive vision. So can y'all give examples of people in, like, for instance, the Buddha, people who you know that I think everybody in the work would like to say that they have glimpses of man number 4 all the time. I know I would. So because you're then working on higher centers. So you or Sy can give some examples, please?
Well, I believe, for example, at Gurdjieff, I mean, I don't know, that's my own opinion, was man number 7. He came into the world as man number 7. He was very, very special. Buddha, Muhammad, people like that, they may also possibly have been man number 7. But it's my understanding that it's not talked about in the work, but man number 8, there was only one man number 8, and that was Jesus. But that's, again, we don't know, but that's, what people think.
Well, I have an example that shows how difficult this is. I did know a man. He was my spiritual mentor. He's quoted extensively in Gurdjieff Unveiled. He was an Englishman who lived in the Himalayas. Sri Madhava Ashish was the Hindu name he took. He was born Alexander Phipps. And there was something about him. I knew from the first time I met him, and I didn't know anything about ideas of this kind. But he was there was something different about him. And over the years, I've tried to figure out what it was. But what helped me was I saw him lose it on one occasion. I'll give you the example. At this ashram in India, meals were served on the kitchen floor for Ashish and a couple of people that lived in the temple building and any visitors. So usually there were maybe 7 or 8 people. On one occasion, a woman, a French woman from Paris, a longtime student of Gurdjieff and Theosophy and Ashish. Um, Somebody asked for the ketchup. We were having a dinner on the floor. Everybody had their plates in front of them. So this woman gets up, picks up the bottle of ketchup, which is right by her, walks across what in effect is the table, it's the kitchen floor, and hands it to the person who requested it. Well, Ashish lost it in that instant. And so I realized that even at that very high level, when he wouldn't get upset about anything, he lost it. So I point this out to show how tricky this is and how careful we have to be about saying someone is at a certain higher level or highest level. Maybe they can lose it, maybe they can't lose it. It's tricky. It's very tricky.
I would think it's interchangeable, Sy. I would hate for people to think that Gurdjieff stayed at level 7 all the time. You know, I mean, all of them. All people go all the way down to 1 because you have to exist, you have to survive. So this hierarchy really would get, you can hear the annoyance in my voice. I don't see it as a hierarchical, like, oh my God, I've slipped to man number 1, what's going to happen to me? You have to take care of the lower centers just like you have to take care of the higher centers. And this is in every tradition, every tradition. So with that said, by the way, we need to go on because we will run out of time if we don't. But I have, and Sy, I want you to go through man number 6, and we have somebody from the chat that wants to ask a question as well. Okay, so Sy, can we move on?
Well, the distinction, Harry mentioned it, between man number 6 and man number 7, whatever they are, Gurdjieff says in man number 7, he's already perfected. He's in this permanent state of, it's more than just what we would call self-remembering. It's you want to call it Buddhahood, I don't know. But the difference is that man number 6 is like man number 7, but it hasn't crystallized in him, and he can lose it. So maybe in the example I gave, Ashish was only a man number 6. He lost it and hollered at this woman from because she was walking across the kitchen table. So,
okay, we have a question about man number 6 from the audience, and I'm going to read it to you, Sy, because it's directed so that you can answer it. I have a question. He says, I have a question about human being number 6. The beginning of the paragraph says he is permanently in the state of self-consciousness. But the last paragraph says he has acquired everything except permanence. Seems to be a contradiction. Am I missing something? It's on the screen.
Well, I don't think you're missing anything, Jeff. It's simply maybe the wording isn't exactly right, but that's the difference. Man number 6 can lose it. Man number 7 can no longer lose it. Now, these are pretty intellectual ideas, so you could take it for what it's worth. But I caution everybody here, you can study this stuff. There's hundreds of books, explaining all of this stuff, but it's not the work. The work is what we're trying right now. Everybody still sensing their left hand? Of course not. You forgot it, right? This is our problem, and this shows our level of unconsciousness. And that's why it requires long periods of time, years literally, to become free of this miseducation of this personality that we mistakenly think we are. So I don't know if
with man number 6, just quickly.
Sure.
During the process of becoming man number 6, they may not be in a permanent state of self-consciousness, but when it crystallizes, they become man number 6, then they are. In other words, they completed the octave, then they are permanently, they can permanently self-observe. And then they're working their way to man number 7. You got to. It's the octave business. When we get into the business of octaves and vibrations and the Enneagram, then we can explain things.
And that is all in the next chapter. So do you want to speak to you and Sy want to speak to the seven center brain that's in the book on pages 24 through 26?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And by the way, I have put on the screen while they're getting the papers together there, Van Leer, who is, you've got all these Gurdjieffians who have written their perception of the work. This is something that was done on the chakras and the Enneagram. The chakras are very related to a lot of Gurdjieff's work. The different centers are related to the chakras. So if any of you have questions about, like if you're in yoga, you want to learn more about the chakras, I can definitely put you on to writers that have done this. Sy has made this book to be complete, kind of to understand the lingo. But there is, like Maurice Nicole wrote 7 volumes of just every one of these things. So it's like you can go to any area. This is Van Leer's diagram of the Enneagram, which we'll take up next week, by the way. But again, I want y'all not to think that this is a totally separate thing that you, those of you who, like me, I've studied meditation, yoga, I'm a psychotherapist. I use Gurdjieff's work all the time. I do not use the terminology. So, and I use it in my astrological work, everything. So anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Sy and Harry to talk about the 7 centers.
Okay. Well, in relation to what you were saying, Gwen, someone during the week sent in a thing about that they're very much involved in Hatha Yoga. And in terms of all of these things being connected, this is Gurdjieff's man number 1. This is the physical man. In fact, he speaks about, and he writes about it and speaks about it. In India, he talks about fakirs, F-A-K-I-R, people who have developed tremendous control over their physical body in one form or another. Maybe they are able to stand on one foot all day long. Things like that requires tremendous physical discipline, which is what Hatha Yoga requires. But we also need to remember, and most of us don't know this, is that Hatha Yoga is only one of 6 what are called schools of yoga in the esoteric Vedic Hindu tradition. There are 5 other schools of yoga that are not Hatha Yoga, but are oriented around some of these other things like the emotions.
Well, I want to interrupt you there and say that by remembering your hand, that's the same type of principle in the attention. You're taking care of remembering your hand at all times, which we're forgetting, right? So
right, and you're saying that, Gwen, brought me back to including the sensation of my left hand in my attention, because it disappeared. It disappeared. I was listening to you, and it disappeared, and all of a sudden, you said hand, bingo, there it is. So this is why, and this is another reason why we need others, it's a rare person who can do this work without others, without some kind of group, even if it's only 2 or 3 people, because we need to remind each other, and that's exactly what you just did for me. So thank you.
Yes, and it also helps you not, everybody in this group is probably very intelligent, reads all the time, gets very involved with their intellect. I get trapped in my intellect. I'm an academic. I get trapped in my intellect. So I have to have these sensations. Remember, Russ Schreiber gave me an exercise to do with my fingers while I am seeing a client, so that I don't forget my body while I'm in my attention, divided attention. So this is very common, but like Sy said, you need to be around people who support you in that, so that you can really learn how to operate from all 3 centers.
Now,
Okay, boys, y'all going to talk about your 7 brains here.
yeah, you asked about that, and it's on begins on page 24 of Gurdjieff Unveiled. It's pretty simple, really. Gurdjieff called us three-brained beings. And by that he meant that we have an intellectual brain, which is centered in the cerebrum. We have an emotional brain, which he felt was centered in the breast, just a little below the heart. Maybe some of you know it more specifically. And we have a moving instinctive center or brain, which he said was based in the spinal column but spread throughout all of the nerves of the body. So in that sense, when we talk about centers, we're talking about brains. A good friend of ours, Keith Buzzell, wrote a book entitled Man as a Three-Brained Being, because this is our ordinary state. So then this is what the centers are. So I wouldn't get too involved in the intellectual differences, if any, between centers and brains. The other thing that was mentioned last week in terms of centers or brains is that 2 things. One, the moving instinctive center is further divided into what Gurdjieff called the moving center. That is, things we have physical control over, like moving our arms and legs. The instinctive center or brain, the part of us which runs the machine without our interference, like the heart beating, the breath, all of these kind of things. And the third part he called the sex center or the sex brain, which actually he thought was the most powerful energy of all. But nevertheless, those are 3 subdivisions of the moving instinctive center. And we also talked last week about 2 higher centers. And Gurdjieff said these higher centers, or higher brains, if you like, are functioning, they're working with us all the time, but we're not connected with them, so we don't get the benefit of them. And in this work, through becoming a man number 5, man number 6, man number 7, we become connected with the higher centers or higher brains, the higher emotional center, the higher intellectual center. The best example I know of is the word love. In our ordinary usage of the word love, that's really a function of the lower emotional center. But there's a higher form of love, maybe expressed in some of these biblical writings, like what you find in the New Testament. But that's the difference. And unless you actually experience it, you can only talk about it. You are not it. So those are the 7 centers or 7 brains.
I'd like to add about we've talked a lot about the centers and man number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But how do we work with them to become for example, a man number 4? We do that by working on the 3 main centers at once. And we do it through activities called 3-centered activities. For example, chopping wood. Well, you use your intellectual center as to how you go about chopping wood, how much you need, and all this and that. Emotional, you can do it. Add joy and good feeling to your activity. And of course, the moving center, the actual chopping and carrying the wood. That is 3-centered activity. So, and balancing that, you use the emotional center, the intellectual center, and the thinking center, the intellectual. You can do it in really most any activity that you can think of. You can do it when you're eating. You can do it when you're reading. For example, even reading out loud, becoming animated as you turn the pages and as you verbalize what it is you're reading, and of course enjoy what you're reading and think about what you're reading. That's a 3-centered activity. That's the only thing I can think of adding to the present discussion on centers and human beings number 1 through 7.
Thank you, Harry. We're going to move right along because we are at the end of our hour, but we're going to probably go our full hour and 15 minutes. I am going to talk a little bit about Gurdjieff's uses of time. He has up here, time began when you were born, it will end when you die. What he's talking about is essence. You're born out of essence. Essence, anything, once you get above man number 4, you start experiencing in your meditation or your sittings that all time, the universe, is out there. That is, there is no linear time until we're born. In astrology, I can see, as an astrologer, I always have to have the time of birth, because the time of birth signified when you go into linear time. You are a child of the universe, which is all time. When we die, we go back into all time as one, which is unity. So it is very difficult to express. For me, I have to express it in astrology. Gurdjieff knew cosmology very backward and forward, and so did some of the others. So there is a small world. What he says down here suggests that we have to understand time in terms of relativity. He pointed out, for example, that an infinitesimally small world, such as a drop of water, contains a whole universe of beings. Just as you arrive on the planet at the time of your birth, the whole potential for your many eyes and your beingness in many areas concerning these areas is going to be possible. So when we do sittings, for instance, when we go into meditation, we are literally allowing the brain to move to a level of all time. That's why like with me, I can go into a sitting thinking I'm going to spend 30 minutes, come out in 2 hours, and think I've only been there 10 minutes. So you lose a sense of time. For those of you who've taken a little nap, thinking you're going to just take a little nap, and you wake up 3 hours later, you lose all sense of time. Because even in the dream world, there is no time. You have to language it coming back into consciousness. So I put up here, if a man wants to awaken spiritually, he must hire somebody who will keep on shaking him for a long time. That's the group work that Sy's talking about. We can all study and go along with our own practices, and that's great. However, if you don't have someone you trust to hold your feet to the fire, you're only doing your own thing, and how do you know? How do you know? So you want to learn how to set aims, set linear aims. We're going to do an exercise that I'm going to let I call them the boys, Harry and Sy, go through this with you, but it's about stops and learning to deal with linear time and to remember yourself in linear time. So do y'all want to say anything about time? Sy loves an exercise he always gives you to walk out into the starry sky, and you look up into the heavens, and you realize that you're just a part of that, but there's no time. But go ahead, Sy, you say it in your words, because you're very romantic.
Well, there are a couple of other things, and again, this is intellectual. It's not going to get you any closer to man number 6 or 7 than anything else other than using the attention. However, as was pointed out, I think by Ouspensky, and Gurdjieff agreed with him, time is different in different cosmoses. For example, if you take the average lifespan of a human being, you would say 70 years, maybe 80 years. The average lifespan of a single cell organism, and I don't have the chart in front of me, is measured in hours, not in 70 or 80 years. And so this is another way to look at time. And there's one other thing I'll mention too, that what we call time in our ordinary existence is motion in space. The rotation of the Earth, it gives us 1 day, 24 hours. The revolving of the Earth around the Sun gives us 1 year, 365 days. But again, I caution you, it's great fun, and there's lots of books on time, higher dimensions of time, written by Gurdjieff students and others as well. But it really isn't the work. But it's interesting. I love talking about it. Over.
Okay, so we can start with the stop exercise for next week. And again, I'm going to ask that we're going to spend the next 2 weeks on lesson number 3 in Gurdjieff Unveiled, which is chapter number 3. So, Sy or Harry, do y'all want to start with the stop exercise?
The stop exercise is a very important exercise. When you stop, you can call a stop to yourselves, or somebody else, for example, in the group can call a stop, and then everybody stops. But when you stop, you don't move. You observe what may be taking your attention. You observe your posture, your breathing, your emotions, and you can observe that you have been asleep. And, when you call a stop, that may come into your mind automatically, especially more often as you do the exercise. And it's a moment of self-remembering or self-observation to some extent. But it's a very, very powerful exercise. And the meals are very important. You set at the meal. Before you dive in, you call a stop. Be present to yourself. Be present to the food, where it came from, where it's going. This is very, very important, as you'll see later on. And be thankful. Thankful for where it came from, for the sacrifice that the plants or animals may have made, so that you may intake their being and raise it to another level. You use it for the developing of your own being, for your own body.
And that's another example of where in other traditions you have the same things, because at the heart of this, it's all the same. For example, in Buddhist monasteries, it's quite common to make a stop before beginning a meal. There's a lot of things to observe there. You maybe don't sit down in the chair or the cushion until the abbot takes his seat. When you're told to begin, maybe you sense the utensils in your hand. These are things that we're so automatic in our usual state that we don't even realize. So the idea of a stop is, so as Harry was saying, we can observe all of these things in us that we ordinarily don't observe at all.
And you can be thankful for the cook and the effort he or she made in preparation of the food. Sure. You can acknowledge your guests and be thankful for their presence. And of course, we don't know how it developed when you say grace, but it's equivalent of saying grace.
I want to mention that I spent a month in a Zen monastery in New Mexico. And at meals, the monks were the ones that handled the meals. We had a one-bowl meal, and like Sy said, nobody was seated until the head monk puts down a stick, and that allows you to sit. Then if there is no talking, there's no getting other people involved in your in anything you're doing, or the guy comes around and lays a stick on your shoulder to remind you to stop and observe yourself. So there is that quiet. I probably digested better during that month than I had in all my life, But there also is a practical way. I put stops on, the ladies will love this. I put stops on the refrigerator. I put a stop sign on the refrigerator so I know when I'm going into the refrigerator, I have to be aware, because just the awareness of that stop makes me aware of habit, because much of this is about habit, and what you're doing is just trying to be aware of it. So we're also going to ask that you read chapter 3 for the 4th session, and it will probably take us 2 different sessions because that's a lot of information. So
I'd like to call to your attention something called the game of stops. It's on page 117 of Gurdjieff Unveiled. You can make a photocopy of this if you want. Give it a try. See how many times during the course of a day and during the course of a week you actually are able to catch yourself and make a stop, even if it's just for 5 seconds, and how often you forget about it. So you might want to look at that. It's on page 117.
Are there any comments or anybody want to say anything in the chat screen about anything going on with you right now? And how did you do with your hand, remembering your hand? I know I have one, but I didn't remember it but twice during this whole session. So it's another thing. You don't want to judge yourself either. I could criticize myself all day on that one.
I remembered my hand many times, but there were also many times I've forgotten it, and I don't remember where. I don't remember the moment when I had forgotten it. That's always interesting to me. You remember doing it, and then keep on doing it, and all of a sudden, what happened? When did I lose that attention? When did I lose that sensing? And you don't know. It's interesting.
Okay, Sy, do you have anything to say before we close for today, or anybody want to have anything to say?
Yeah, for those who want to undertake the stop exercise, try the game of stops. It gives you specific times during the course of a day to make a stop. See how you do on it. So, because all of this stuff, unless we can verify that this is practical, that this is real, it's just a bunch of words in a book. So you have to try some of these things and see if they make sense. I have nothing else, Gwen.
Okay, well, we will see you all next week, and enjoy your week, and just remember to remember yourself.
Thank you, everybody.